Hi, it's David Taylor here. I'm an editor at Tortoise. On our weekly show, The Slow Newscast, we tell the story of a political chameleon.
JD has proven himself more dangerous and farther to the right of Donald Trump.
JD Vance. He's a man some people treat as a joke, but we think he needs to be taken seriously. To listen to Beyond Trump, JD Vance and the New Right, search for The Slow Newscast wherever you get your podcasts. And follow the feed to make sure you don't miss an episode.
Hello and welcome to Electoral Dysfunction with me, Beth Rigby.
Me, Ruth Davidson.
And me, Harriet Harman in fabulous Liverpool.
She's looking fabulous in Liverpool. She's got some big speeches to do, that Harriet Harman, today. What are you doing, Harriet?
I'm speaking to the Pensions and Lifetime Savers Association and telling them everything is on the up.
There you go. We're going to be talking about that in a bit. But it's been a treat to see many of your faces again, because you've been sending us pictures from where you've been listening, including in the shower.
What?
What do you think of that, ladies?
Do you remember when Johnny Mercer, the former MP, did a picture of himself in the shower?
It was an advert.
It was for Dove for Men. I remember it.
I remember it too. He was sort of soaping himself down. Anyway, send us all your shower pictures.
No,
or in the bath.
Don't.
Keep the pictures coming. I'm going to post some of them on my socials to share the love. And remember that if you like us, do tell your friends, hit follow so you never miss us, and leave us a review. We love hearing from you, but don't leave one of those reviews with 1 star. Now, on this episode of Lecky D, thanks to Alistair, who emailed us to say that's what he calls us, Lecky D.
I like that.
I like that too. Also, my cousin is called Alexis, and her shortened version is Lecky. So whenever I hear of Lecky, I think of my cousin, who I love a lot. So that really does make me feel happy. Right, today we're going to be asking whether the government's got itself into another hole over the budget. And does it matter how they actually define working people? This budget is now being billed as historic, unprecedented. It's getting bigger by the day. We're going to talk about that. And we'll chat about media appearances for politicians. Which ones actually make an impact these days? Has the strategy changed? We're less than 2 weeks away now from the first ever budget delivered by a female chancellor. It's the first Labour budget in 15 years. Since the election, we've been told by Labour it was going to be a hard budget anyway, but this week it feels like it is getting into the stages of being defined as unprecedented. I tend to not use that word, but just the enormity of it and the weight of the decisions that Rachel Reeves is got to make. The talk of up to £40 billion in tax rises or spending cuts that she is going to have to find. You know, they were talking about a so-called £22 billion black hole. It's getting bigger and bigger, and that means that there are going to be some very difficult choices. Indeed, there's pressure on her about tax rises. There's questions about whether lifting employers' national insurance, which they look almost set to do, is going to break manifesto pledges. And now the cabinet are writing to Keir Starmer over the head of Rachel Reeves, the likes of Angie Rayner. I'm hearing it's Lou Haig in Transport, Shabana Mahmood in Justice, complaining about departmental cuts going over the Chancellor's head to Starmer. But more importantly than that being leaked, which gives you a sense of the unhappiness around the government yet again. Harriet, can you just explain what's actually happened this week?
Well, what is happening is that we are heading towards what is described as a consequential budget, because it's the first budget of this new Labour government, so we'll set the trend for the future. Because we're in unprecedentedly difficult economic circumstances, because we've made promises that constrain our room for manoeuvre in the manifesto, and we need to keep them. But I think it's also unprecedented, and I can't let this go without commenting it. Rachel Reeves is not just the first female chancellor. She's the first Chancellor who's a working mother and a feminist. And she knows from what we now describe as lived experience, the importance of childcare, the unfairness of unequal pay. And so she's not just any old woman Chancellor, she's a feminist woman Chancellor. And I think she'll be expecting to do a budget which will push for growth and will keep our manifesto promises. The trouble is there's a bit of a hiatus before the budget because there's like budget purdah. The normal rule is that you announce everything all at once on one day, and that is necessary because of market sensitivity. You don't let it out in advance in dribs and drabs, waiting until everybody is sitting there on the green benches and we'll hear her read out her budget. And at that point, even at that point, cabinet ministers will not actually know what the budget is doing to their department. So you'll see them all looking very knowledgeable and supportive, but their hearts will be in their mouth because they won't know what's in the budget because it's not signed off until the very last minute. They won't know whether they're going to strut back to their department as a conquering hero or whether they're going to go back with their tail between their legs, having to do absolutely terrible cuts.
What's going on here is that the government are arguing that they have found this black hole in the public finances. Essentially what that is that the spending commitments and the tax commitments that the previous government have made do not add up, and it leaves a hole in the public finances that then has to be filled by either tax rises or spending cuts. Now, the government had said it was 22 billion. There was a report in the Financial Times earlier this week saying it's now up to 40 billion. So it's even worse. I've checked it out with other sources in government. They say that that is about right. But the point of it is you've now got a chancellor saying that they need to clear out the decks, that they need to deal with this massive black hole in the public finances. That either means massive tax rises or massive spending cuts. But the scale of the hole means it probably means both. And why is this so difficult? Well, this is a government that in the run-up to the general election promised not to raise national insurance, VAT and income tax. Now, the government get about 2/3 of their revenue from those three taxes. So if you rule those out, it's really hard to find manoeuvrability. And now what the government are talking about, and this is where the row is emerging, is about whether or not they lift NI for employers. So you as a working person do not get your NI raised what you pay, but your employer will have to pay national insurance up to about 13.8%. That could raise up to £17 billion for the government, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. But now there's an almighty row about whether that's breaking a manifesto promise. I mean, Ruth, it is a bloody difficult budget, isn't it, for Reeves?
Yeah, it is. And this kind of wheeze that kind of popped up, I don't know, maybe a week, 10 days ago now, that she wouldn't raise national insurance contributions that are seen on the right-hand side of your payslip, but she'd do it for employers only, and that wouldn't therefore break the spirit of the promise, although it would break the wording of what they said on the run-up to the election, has come a little bit unstuck over the last 10 days, because you've had people like Paul Johnson from the Institute of Fiscal Studies saying that increasing the employer rate would be, his quote, straightforward break with the manifesto commitment. You've also got the OBR, who is the Office of Budget Responsibility. They're supposed to be a kind of independent scoring organisation, saying that raising national insurers' contributions for employers would then depress wages for working people. So it's still a burden on working people. And she's going to have to do a heck of a job to sell it, if that is the kind of magic thing that's going to fix the hole. They also, I'm not sure Harriet's right in saying that there's virtue for Rachel Reeves in springing things on her colleagues who do have departments to run and that they don't know where the axe is necessarily going to fall. I think that's really difficult, because if you're being asked to go out and defend a budget that causes pain, you need everybody to be on side with that. They need to know exactly what they're expecting and not be caught out. And it's not just your cabinet colleagues that you need to behave and to go out and play with a straight bat and defend it. You actually kind of need the SPADs and the people that are Treasury insiders or any of the rest of it to shut up and be on board as well. And that's, I think, where the danger is.
Also, Harriet, in terms of the leaking, it does speak to some disquiet. I mean, I spoke to someone around the government and they said it's a normal process that cabinet ministers, when you are talking about spending cuts, would potentially go over the head of the Chancellor and write directly to a Prime Minister. But the point is that someone has then told the press, and one person said to me this morning, if any cabinet minister thinks briefing the media is going to make Starmer move or actually put any distance between Reeves and Starmer, they are, quote, completely deluded. Writing to the Prime Minister, a normal process, briefing to the media is not a good idea. There's a couple of things going on. One, it shows the disquiet within the cabinet about the spending cuts that are coming down the line in 2025 to 2026. And there's certain departments that are going to really suffer. And Harriet, you're calling it the consequential budget. I've been told now it's an unprecedented budget in terms of the scope, the tone, how it's going to set the entire parameters, if you like, of the administration. But all the leaks,
I know that Paul Johnson has been saying if she puts up national insurance contributions on employers' contributions, if she puts employers' contributions up on national insurance, that will be breaking a manifesto commitment. Having looked at the manifesto, I love reading Labour manifestos and indeed all manifestos, I can't see where he gets that from. I mean, I usually agree with him on everything and have got huge admiration for him, but this is what the manifesto says. The phrase national insurance appears only once in Labour's 2024 manifesto. So the bit that I'm reading out is the only bit. It says, we will ensure taxes on working people, and working people means employees. It doesn't mean businesses. We will ensure taxes on working people are kept as low as possible. Labour will not increase taxes on working people, which is why we will not increase national insurance.
Wait a minute. You are splitting hairs. We will not increase national insurance. Did you literally just read that out and then say that increasing national insurance isn't increasing national insurance?
No, because it's one sentence. It's one whole sentence here, Ruth. One whole sentence.
Well, good luck with selling that.
Labour will not increase taxes on working people, which is why we will not increase national insurance.
Okay, I'm going to play. I'm going to play a hypothetical game with you, Harriet. So, say that was a Conservative manifesto, and you had a Conservative Chancellor that stood up at the dispatch box and said, "I know that in our manifesto from merely 3 months ago, we said the words, quote unquote, we will not increase national insurance." But what I'm doing is increasing national insurance for employers, not employees, so I'm not breaking my manifesto commitments. As a Labour person, would you A, believe them, B, shout at them and tell them that they were a liar, or C, run off and make sure that your press officers pounded them day after day after day in the press that because they raised national insurance when the words in their manifesto of merely 112 days ago was, we will not raise national insurance, because you are splitting hairs.
Not at all. I would in the election campaign, I would be saying, I have seen this sentence. Where is employers' national insurance commitment on this? Are you going to rule out increasing national insurance contributions for employers? And when they wouldn't rule it out, then we would know. But it's absolutely clear what they are ruling out, which is they are ruling out increasing national insurance contributions for employees. That's the first thing. The second thing is, Ruth, you're saying, if you want cabinet members to support the Chancellor's budget, you need to bring them on board by consulting them. That's not the reality. The reality is really difficult decisions are being made as between different government departments, as between cuts and tax raises, and everybody is bound to be dissatisfied in that situation. That is what happens every single time. But what also should happen is that there is collective responsibility. So when they are sitting there on the green benches, looking knowing and thoughtful, when in fact they don't know and they're panic struck, they know that the deal is that if you are in the cabinet, if you're appointed to be in the cabinet and you accept that, we know what Keir Starmer's been saying about it being a painful decision, the budget. They have bought into that by accepting a cabinet position, and they should accept collective responsibility. As far as leaking is concerned, we've had a bit of a discussion last week on the pod about whether or not it's right to call Keir Starmer ruthless, and whether we should be calling him instead determined, committed, purposeful. Actually, I think he probably will be ruthless when he knows, as he inevitably will, who will be leaking. He will be ruthless on that.
I spoke to some people in the Treasury over the weekend about this, and they were making the point to me that it was about working people's taxes, that they actually didn't answer the question in the run-up to the general election about employers on NI. So there is a view, which is Harriet's view, which is actually, they said it about working people, and that's how they make the distinction. But going back to what Ruth said, for the public, what they heard was, we will not raise taxes on NI. And if the opposition can land it politically, this could be a problem.
Rishi Sunak got absolutely hammered, and the Tory party got absolutely hammered for saying that the potential tax rises from Labour would amount to around £2,000 per working age person across the country. Let's see what's happened in this budget, and let's see how close he got, because whatever you think of him as a political operator, and I've questioned his political skills and his touch and his feel for politics, Rishi Sunak knows numbers. It'll be really interesting to see what number comes out at the end of this.
Well, when you say, Beth, that people will have heard when Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves were talking before the election, they will have thought, oh, this means no increases on national insurance paid by me, the employee, nor paid by the employer. I don't think they will have heard that. I think most people think of national insurance contributions in relation to their own national insurance contributions that they pay. They think of national insurance contributions paid by the employer, if they think about it at all, as a business tax. Now, leaving aside the merits of how business are going to like it or not and what it's going to do to employment, I do think they did give themselves that wriggle room to actually put taxes on employers' national insurance. I don't know whether they're going to do that, but they certainly do need to raise some money, because they've not got to actually just fill that black hole of, as you say, Beth, a whole load of spending commitments which were made and are underway, and yet without the money coming in to fund them. But they've also got to do some starting of repairing on the huge problem that there is in public services. So they need to raise more than that £22 billion.
I think there's a wider problem here for the Labour Party. There's been something slightly wondrous watching the Bambi-like, wide-eyed penny dropping of how hard being in government is at the time when there are constraints and how much they're struggling with it. But the wider problem I have is that I think Harriet's right. As much as people think about individual measures at all, they perhaps don't consider individual strands of stuff. But wider narratives people get, and they latch onto them pretty early. And there is already a narrative that says, Keir Starmer promised one thing to become leader of the Labour Party, and he did something else once he got it. I think if in your very first budget, there's a narrative that runs that he promised people one thing and then broke it immediately after, you start getting into a pattern, and it is very hard to undo. You know, he's not had the best honeymoon period, despite his large majority. This budget is massive because part of the reason he hasn't had a good honeymoon is because he hasn't said enough. The drumbeat of announcements hasn't been fast enough. It's not filled the void. So there is more riding on this budget than there would have been if he put more in the King's speech, if he put more in his first sort of back to government speech that he did after the summer, more in his conference speech, which had no policy in it, hardly at all. There is so much riding on Rachel Reeves because there's been an absence of stuff elsewhere. And if they don't land the idea that by saying, we will not raise national insurance, and then raising it on one half of it isn't some form of a lie, then I think they could be in trouble in terms of the public opinion around them.
Ruth, though, when I talk to some people in government, one of the ways it has been framed to me is that as they have got deeper into looking under the bonnet of the government books, the argument was made to me by one senior figure that if you think about the 2010 budget when George Osborne came into the Treasury, it was unprecedented. This is what this person said to me, because it was a budget that had to unpick after a financial crisis. And they are now framing this, at least, as an unprecedented budget because they now have to unpick the black hole that was created by a Conservative administration.
Yeah. So I think they're right to try and argue that it is some kind of a black swan budget in the same way the other ones have, as in something that's very unusual. I think the difficulty that you have is that what they're not doing, because they don't want to do this, is then link it to the event. What you're not saying is this is a hangover from COVID. That's the event, which meant that all the receipts didn't work. Brexit as part of that as well, because that's changed the profile of our financing. These are hard concepts to sell people, because nobody likes to think that my pay only went up by 3% this year because all of this other stuff happened either 3 years ago or over here. And it is going to be hard for the Tories to defend that, but it's going to also be hard for the Labour Party to land the idea of this is a black swan budget if they don't link it to an event. And that's the event. Like, the COVID tail is the event, and Brexit is part of that because it also diminished our profile, and they're terrified of saying that too.
I think we are linking it to events. I love the idea of a black swan budget. I think that's, I'm going to definitely adopt that, Ruth. They are linking it to Brexit. They are linking it to COVID. They are linking it to the war in Ukraine that really pushed down people's living standards because it pushed up energy prices. But they are also linking it to one event, which you have failed to mention, I notice, Ruth. Can you guess what that is? Yeah, it's Liz Truss's budget. I mean, that was like the hand grenade that came in and exploded the difficulties and multiplied them. So there's actually very direct Tory responsibility for the bad deal on Brexit, not for COVID, that's not their responsibility. But 4 of the events that create such a difficult framework for this budget were directly caused by the Tories, the bad deal on Brexit and the disastrous Liz Truss budget. But anyway, there's a big black hole. We're not going to break a manifesto commitment. We're going to set the country on the path to growth. And all the cabinet ministers have got to pull in behind Rachel.
You might be breaking a manifesto commitment.
Well, I have to say that you two on national insurance contributions has been the biggest Barney I've ever seen between you.
Isn't it?
Proper big disagreement there. I'm just going to leave it with one thought, though, because this thing about working people and taxation is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting. And Harriet, you're saying that that's the way that the government will justify the NI rise, raising a lot of money from employers, that it's about what's in your pay packet. But what if they decide, for example, to reband houses, so council tax changes, or do something on fuel duty, or even capital gains tax on shares? I mean, this working people, it could unravel a bit in the budget, couldn't it? It's quite difficult for them.
Well, none of those things are employees' pay packets, which is what they're talking about. And council tax, that's an outgoing, but that will take if they are going to do anything around that, that takes quite a while to actually happen. So we'll see. But, we all know it's going to be tough.
Well, we are going to have a budget special in a couple of weeks' time. Honestly, this budget, I was so involved in doing the 100 days, and now my attention is turning to this budget, and I am looking at what Rachel Reeves has on her hands. And for someone that is an expert chess player, I imagine she's playing 4-dimensional chess and trying very hard not to be completely boxed in. It is one hell of a budget that we are going to get. I think it will be historic. I think it will be, to quote Ruth, I love it too, a black swan event.
It's the black swan budget. It's been named here on the Electoral Dysfunction podcast.
We've got to take a break here, but when we come back, we'll discuss why Kemi Badenoch doesn't do many interviews.
Listeners to Electoral Dysfunction know the world is in this new phase of chaos, the era that I term the enduring disorder. I'm Jason Pack, the host of Disorder. This is a podcast where every Tuesday we look at why world leaders aren't working together, and we end every show by proposing solutions as we order the disorder. So after you've understood dysfunction on a Friday with Beth, Ruth, and Harriet, please join me on Tuesdays for Disorder. Follow the link in the show notes to listen to it right now.
We are back. And I wanted to talk about how politicians are trying to get their message across nowadays, because we've got just a couple of weeks left of the Tory leadership contest. We've heard a lot from Robert Jenrick. I can't turn on the television without Robert Jenrick being on the airwaves, but we've heard a lot less from his opponent, Kemi Badenoch. Obviously, there are reasons why politicians sometimes avoid public debate. Normally, when you are the front runner, less is more. Politicians are always calculated in this, aren't they? There is a debate on GB News on Thursday night, but in terms of other blue-on-blue public events, I can tell you now we're all struggling to get them to agree to do it. Ruth, what does it tell us about the two candidates? Does Kemi need to be on camera? Does she need to come on podcasts?
I think it tells you that she thinks she's winning. The Conservative Party membership is incredibly hard to poll because it's small, people don't declare it particularly, but she clearly thinks she's winning and she doesn't have to chase it. Robert Jenrick clearly thinks that he's got work to do and that the more people see of him, the more they will like him. I think the assessment that's been made by Kemi's camp is that there is merit, and there's often merit, in being a slightly blanker page that people can project what they want onto, so that people think that she is their type of Tory and one that they would be comfortable voting for. But there is certainly a lack of confidence, I think, in somebody who seems to be picking their choices of what media that they do to be media that is very much considered to have a high proportion of people that are already Conservative members and voters. So the Telegraph, for example, maybe some Mail stuff, maybe the Express, etc. You know, this is somebody that is going to have to rebuild the Tory party, and they're going to have to do it by talking beyond people that are already diehard Tories. In a weird way, it's a sign of both confidence and not confidence that she's not doing that much. Confidence that she's already in the lead, not confidence and she thinks that if people see more of her, she might lose that lead.
Just from a perspective of how do we line it up as journalists, what will be happening now is all the channels will put offers in to do a leadership debate. Obviously, this at the moment, in this case, is going through Conservative campaign headquarters. So actually the Conservative Party is kind of organising this, and you've got a world in which Jenrick wants to do everything and Badenoch doesn't want to do anything, and Conservative campaign headquarters does not want loads of blue on blue infighting. So they kind of agreed to GB News. That is where a lot of Tory party members watch their news. Jenrick's trying to publicly pressure Badenoch into doing a debate on the BBC, etc., etc. In a general election, the way that it works is that both main parties will always do something with ITV and the BBC. That's kind of locked in because they have such big audiences. In the last election, we also secured a debate largely because we had a target towns strategy where we went to Grimsby time and again over the whole election period in the run-up to it. But equally, I have to say in elections, leaders and leadership elections, leaders will also swerve stuff. So you remember in 2019 general election, Jeremy Corbyn agreed to do an Andrew Neil interview. Andrew Neil's team thought that Boris Johnson was also going to come and do that interview. Corbyn went up against Andrew Neil, got absolutely savaged, and then Boris Johnson swerved the whole event. Do you remember it? And what you find is in elections, leaders decide how much exposure or not they will take. And if you are the underdog, you have to take more risk because you just have to get out there. And Ruth, you've had to do a lot of this.
Yeah.
How does it work from a politician's point of view? Like, what do you get offered up? What do you decide to do? How do you interact with the party on that? Do you just go like rogue and do what the hell you want? How does it actually work from a politician's perspective?
In the leadership election, I mean, you and your team work incredibly closely to try and get some people on side that are going to back you. So you do as much as you can. You make sure that, particularly if you're not the front runner, and I wasn't when I ran, I'd only been a politician for a couple of months. I'd only just been elected and I was running against the established deputy leader of the party and a couple of other people that had also been in Parliament for a long time. So, you know, we had to make sure we had a drumbeat, we had policy announcements, we had to do quite a lot of featurey stuff, so people knew who I was. I had a particular issue when I ran in that everybody else was described by their job in the paper, and I was described by an element of my life. So it was Deputy Leader Murdo Fraser, Transport Convener Margaret Mitchell, Transport Spokesman Jackson Carlo, and lesbian kickboxer Ruth Davidson. And that's how the Daily Mail in Scotland called me all the time.
How did you feel about being straplined as lesbian kickboxer?
Well, I mean, hopefully I have a lot more to say than just talking about kickboxing and lesbianism, although I'm happy to discuss both on this podcast, as you know. Always happy to discuss it. It took a while once I was elected to get that dropped.
Did it irritate you?
Yes, it did, because I wasn't being treated the same as everybody else, and I thought there was a grievance of unfairness there. And they were doing it particularly to tell them something, which was that I was different and something that they disapproved of and should disapprove of, and that I wasn't a serious candidate. And I believed that I was, and that I deserved to be treated the same as everybody else. So there was a particular level of satisfaction that after a few months in the job, I began being referred to as just Tory leader Ruth Davidson. But yeah, so what we did was we did as much soft stuff as we could to introduce me to people, because I wasn't known. So we did feature stuff talking about my life, about the fact that actually there was lots of quite conventional things in my life that Conservatives might also like, and that might sort of slightly dilute the fact that they were scared of a lesbian kickboxer, that I'd been a Sunday school teacher, that I was a member of my church, that I'd been in the Territorial Army, that I was committed to the armed forces, you know, all of these kind of institutional touch points, because I was somebody that the party didn't know. And I also worked my ass off. And one of the things that, if Kemi is doing it, which is what she says she's doing, is meeting individual party members in group events and in the constituencies, then she's right to do that too. I was the only one of the 4 that went to every mainland Scottish constituency, because they needed to see me and ask me questions. And, you know, they want to see the cut of your jib. They want to see it.
Well, what you just said, Ruth, just reminds me once again why I'm both sad and glad that you are not running in this leadership election. But for Kemi and Robert Jenrick, I think that especially Kemi should remember lessons from 2 Labour leadership campaigns, where the front runner, because they didn't feel they needed to do so much, and because they would do less and thereby avoid any risk and just keep their front position, actually lost. So think about David Miliband and Ed Miliband. David Miliband was considered absolutely the front runner, but Ed Miliband worked harder and did more and saw more people and did more interviews, and he won by a whisker. So there's no substitute for absolutely the hard work. But the other thing I'd say about Robert Jenrick, there's something so profoundly unmemorable about Robert Jenrick. You know, you can see him and hear him, and you can forget what he looks like, and you can forget what he says immediately until you see him again, and then you immediately forget what he looks like and what he says. Kemi is memorable, but not in a good way. But Robert Jenrick, I mean, I just don't know whether he's got what it takes to get traction at this point in opposition politics. I don't think he's going to be able to grab the mic if he manages to grab the Tory leadership.
That was savage. I think I need to just go and have a quick lie down. This is kind of what the Jenrick team are saying to me about it, which is their view is anytime, any place, any audience, we will debate her. And this is what one of his campaign teams said to me about it. They said, debating your opponents is literally the job of the leader of the opposition. You can't do that job if you're not properly prepared to do that. I mean, Badenoch is going to have a bit of an issue here, isn't she? She's trying to swerve all media, doesn't appear to like engaging with us at all. Is there an issue there, Harriet? What do you think as a former deputy leader of an opposition party?
She will get the microphone because she is that sort of politician. But I think she might not get it in a good way for the Conservatives. I think she will be to social policy what Liz Truss was to economic policy. It'll be absolutely explosions and disasters all the way. Tories might live to rue the day that the microphone is in her hands, whereas Robert Jenrick is an invisible kind of safe pair of hands, although he did make a big gaffe at Tory party conference when he more or less accused our special forces of murdering people rather than taking them prisoner because he feared that the International Court of Human Rights would actually let them out of custody if they were taken alive, which was the most terrible thing to say, and he never drew back on. But aside from that, even if he does say terrible things, I don't think anybody's going to remember him.
The issue that I have with him up until this point is that he's not said enough. Yes, he's doing lots and lots of interviews, but it's not like he's got a big policy platform. It's not like he's laid out how we rebuild and how we, whether he wants to put in organisers in particular parts of the country, how he wants to do the actual nuts and bolts of rebuilding the vote where he sees the areas are.
So have you decided, Ruth? Put us out of our misery.
No, I'm
have
not,
you
I'm not telling
decided
you.
yet?
I told you last week I'm not telling you. Let's see what happens. I think there's a lot of potholes between now and the vote.
We'll give you a bit more time.
Maybe your ballot paper will get lost down a pothole.
Well, who knows? Who knows?
Ruth, just to finish off, if we look stateside, there are some parallels in the US with what we're talking about, because the election's around the corner. Kamala Harris is doing every media slot. It's interesting that she got the kind of lead in the summer in the polls, and then a poll out by NBC News just a few days ago showed that they are neck and neck. She even went up on Fox News, which has been, some people would say, backfired on her. Other people would say she got her message out to say that she was a change from Biden. There's been both versions of that interview on some of the socials. Donald Trump's just sticking to core supporters. They're both doing a lot of podcasts. What do you think of the strategy, Ruth?
I think it's because there's no outright frontrunner there. I think that even if you look at the polls, the biggest sort of gap that you're seeing is gender gap between them. So more women are voting for Kamala Harris, more men are voting for Donald Trump. So I think one of the things that Kamala Harris's camp has decided to do is try and peel as many as they can to show that even if you're not a natural Democrat, if you're a Republican that doesn't like Trump, you can vote for her. I think that's part of the strategy. So doing Fox News, even if you get duffed up, you get points for fronting up and for, being able to string a sentence together and not doing some of the weird stuff that Trump is doing right now, where he's just standing on stage swaying to music or saying crazy stuff. But she's also, as well as doing a lot of the female podcasts, so particularly at younger women and voters that are just entering, this will be their first election to vote in. There's a very strong suspicion that she's going to cross over and do one of the really big male podcasts called The Joe Rogan Experience, which is one of the biggest podcasts in the world. And it's again that idea of even if you can just peel away a couple of thousand people and realise that even if you're not a natural Democrat, if you hate Trump, there is some place for you to go.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because when you actually look at how this election is going to be defined, it is going to be these tiny margins of voters, even a few thousand voters. Harris's deputy campaign manager explains the strategy by saying, if you consume political info, you want to consume political info. Most of the remaining voters we need to talk to don't. I mean, they're basically saying, so we have to go and find them and get them, and that kind of tiny slither in the middle that are undecided. Has that always been the case, do you think, for politicians?
Well, I think one new thing about that is that we might look back on this US election and say this is the first election where a decisive influence in terms of communication was podcasts. Because podcasts allow you to go deep, not necessarily wide into a demographic, but deep into it. And that's what Kamala Harris has been doing. But we'll see whether it turns out, because as Ruth rightly says, it's all about the small number of voters in the swing states. So I think it's becoming very, what we used to call sort of rainbow politics, going down each segment, each sector. But podcasts are the route into that, because they have perhaps not huge numbers, but although in some cases they do have huge numbers, but they're very much committed and passionate supporters of that pod. And she goes into their living rooms. She goes into their daily conversation by going into that podcast.
On the matter of niche pod identities, I want to bring you this question from Sue. She says, I've just seen your newish podcast photo with Harriet, and I have a question. Are you now only accepting people with a bob? Is this a new bob cult? If so, I'm loving it. Laugh emoji. So, yes, it is. And Ruth, we need you to grow your hair.
I can bring you a picture of me with a bob because I used to have one a very long time ago.
Okay, so we're going to Photoshop that onto our podcast. Harriet and I do have similar hairstyles, but it was not a requisite of who was going to join the pod. But
I think that's a very sharp political question, because the question of hair and identity is a very deep one for women. Beth, you seem to have a very lovely cat on your shoulder. Are you a mad cat lady? I think you are.
I'm a totally mad cat lady. The cat on my shoulder is Scooby. He really likes sitting on my shoulders, which is... I had to open the door halfway through this record because they were just at the window. But also, on the matter of bobs, Rachel Reeves has got a bob. Bridget Phillipson's got a bob.
Powerful bobs there.
Liz Truss definitely got a more bob cut. Anyway, I am all for a power bob, as you all know. I've got a vested interest in power bobs. I love them. So thank you for that question, Sue. Now remember, to get in touch with your questions too, we'd especially love to hear what you want to know about the US election. It's less than 3 weeks away now, and we want to answer some of your questions or get experts in to do it for us. So just send us a voice note to the burner phone 07934 200 444 or email us at electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Thanks, ladies, and thank you all for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.